The air at the port was a chaotic symphony of noise and emotion. The mournful blast of a ship's horn echoed across the water, mingling with the screech of gulls and the frantic shouts of dock workers. It was a place of beginnings and endings, of tearful goodbyes and hopeful departures. For Arthur, a 78-year-old widower standing at the foot of a gangplank that seemed to stretch to the sky, it felt only like an ending. His children, Mark and Cynthia, fussed around him with a frantic, suffocating energy. They adjusted the collar of his coat, straightened his tie, and patted his shoulder with a performative affection that felt as hollow as a drum. They called this a gift of a lifetime, a luxury transatlantic cruise to celebrate his retirement, a retirement that had begun the day his wife, Eleanor, had died 2 years ago. "You deserve this, Dad," Mark said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. He was a man who had inherited his father's height, but none of his quiet strength. His face was perpetually flushed with the stress of a life lived on the edge of financial ruin, a fact he skillfully concealed behind a veneer of forced optimism. A real chance to relax, see the world, get some sun. "We'll miss you terribly, of course," Cynthia added, her hug brief and brittle. She was her brother's echo, a woman whose own anxieties were masked by a sharp, critical edge. "But you need to get out, meet new people. It's not healthy to be cooped up in that big house all alone." Arthur played his part. He nodded, smiled, and allowed them to steer him toward the towering white hull of the cruise ship, a floating city named the Serene Majesty. He saw the way they exchanged quick, furtive glances over his head when they thought he wasn't looking. He felt the tension in their hands, the desperate, almost frantic need to get him onto the ship and out of their lives. He had known for months that he had become a burden. After Eleanor's death, the house, once a warm haven of shared memories, had become a silent, looming responsibility in their eyes. It was an asset to be managed, and he, its sole occupant, was the primary obstacle to its liquidation. Their visits had become less frequent, their conversations strained, always circling back to the same themes: the cost of maintaining the house, the dangers of an old man living alone, the options available for someone in his situation. Now they had found their final solution, wrapped in the glittering paper of a luxury cruise. "We've taken care of everything, Dad," Mark said, pressing a thick envelope into Arthur's coat pocket. "This is for your onboard expenses, tips, a little something extra for souvenirs. Don't you worry about a thing at home," Cynthia added. "We'll handle everything. Just relax and enjoy yourself." The final goodbyes were a blur of tight smiles and hasty hugs. As Arthur began his slow ascent up the gangplank, he looked back one last time. He saw his children standing on the pier, waving with an almost manic enthusiasm. They looked small and distant, two strangers who shared his blood but not his heart. The moment he was out of their direct line of sight, he saw them turn to each other, a shared look of profound, undisguised relief passing between them. They didn't wait for the ship to pull away. They simply turned and walked briskly toward the parking lot, their duty done, their problem solved. Arthur found his cabin on one of the lower decks. It was small, windowless, and smelled faintly of disinfectant. It was the cheapest accommodation on the ship, a fact that seemed at odds with their grand pronouncements of a gift of a lifetime. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the gentle thrum of the ship's engines a low, constant vibration beneath his feet. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the envelope Mark had given him. Inside, nestled amongst a stack of crisp $100 bills, was a glossy, trifold brochure. The cover showed a sun-drenched Spanish villa surrounded by palm trees. The title, in elegant gold script, read, "Golden Horizon Senior Residence, a New Beginning in the Sun." His blood ran cold. He flipped through the brochure. Pictures of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard, a pristine swimming pool, a cheerful, sterile-looking dining hall. It was a gilded cage, a beautifully packaged final resting place. Tucked inside the brochure was a single sheet of paper, a note handwritten by Cynthia. Her familiar, looping script seemed to mock him from the page. "Dad, we know this is a shock, but please try to understand. It's for the best. We were so worried about you, all alone in that big house. Golden Horizons is a wonderful place, with round-the-clock medical care and plenty of activities. We sold the house to cover the costs and to ensure you have a comfortable, worry-free life. This isn't a goodbye, it's a new beginning. We'll visit when we can. With all our love, Mark and Cynthia Arthur." Read the note twice, then a third time. The words blurred, the cheerful, condescending phrases twisting into a knot of pure, cold betrayal. "We sold the house. His home, the place he and Eleanor had filled with 40 years of love and laughter, the place where he had held her hand as she took her final breath, sold. Without his knowledge, without his consent. This wasn't a cruise, it was an exile. A one-way ticket to a life sentence in a foreign country, paid for with the rubble of his own past." He stood up and walked numbly out of the cabin, making his way through the labyrinthine corridors to the open deck. The ship was now moving, the shoreline a rapidly receding smudge on the horizon. The city he had called home his entire life was shrinking, disappearing into the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. He stood at the railing, the wind whipping at his thin coat, the salt spray cold on his face. He was adrift, a man without a country, without a home, without a family. He looked out at the endless gray water, and for the first time since Eleanor had died, he felt utterly and completely alone. The serene majesty sailed on, carrying him toward his gilded prison, a silent, invisible passenger whose life had just been stolen from him by the two people he had trusted most in the world. The first few days of the cruise passed in a muted, gray fog. Arthur existed as a ghost on a ship of ghosts, a vessel teeming with cheerful, sun-seeking passengers, yet he felt profoundly invisible. The ship itself was a monument to forced merriment. The relentless cheer of the cruise director, the blare of calypso music from the poolside speakers, the clatter of chips in the casino, it all felt like a grotesque, mocking counterpoint to the cold, silent void that had opened in his life. He avoided the grand dining halls with their clinking silverware and polite, meaningless chatter. He took his meals at odd hours in the near-empty buffet, sitting alone at a small table by a window, staring out at the endless, churning expanse of the Atlantic. The ocean was a vast, featureless desert, a perfect mirror of his own internal landscape. He was adrift, with no destination he had chosen, no harbor he could call his own. He would walk the decks for hours, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He watched the other passengers, the boisterous families, the hand-holding elderly couples, the bright, hopeful young people, and felt a sense of alienation so profound It was like a physical barrier. They were living in a world he no longer belonged to, a world of shared laughter and easy affection. His world had been reduced to a single windowless cabin and a brochure for a Spanish retirement home. In the crushing loneliness of the open sea, his mind began to retreat. It slipped away from the painful present and drifted back to a time and place where the word family had a different, more potent meaning. He found himself thinking not of his children, but of his brothers. Not his brothers by blood, but his brothers by fire. He thought of Vietnam. The memories came back not in a flood, but in sharp, vivid fragments. The oppressive, wet heat of the jungle, the constant, gnawing fear that lived in the pit of his stomach, the metallic taste of sea rations, the deafening roar of a Huey's rotors. He had spent a lifetime trying to bury those memories, to build a quiet, peaceful life on top of them. But now, stripped of everything else, they were all he had left. He remembered the faces of the young men in his platoon, boys of 18 and 19 who had been forced to become men overnight. He remembered the shared jokes, the letters from home read aloud, the quiet, unspoken pacts they made with each other. In that crucible of fear and violence, they had forged a bond that was stronger, purer, and more real than any blood tie he had ever known. They had relied on each other for their very survival. They were a unit, a family, and their love was measured not in gifts or hollow words, but in a willingness to lay down their lives for one another. And most of all, he remembered Danny Rivers. Danny had been his opposite in every way. Arthur was quiet, cautious, a farm boy from the Midwest who had been drafted against his will. Danny was a fast-talking, charismatic kid from the streets of Philadelphia, a volunteer who saw the war as a grand, if terrifying, adventure. He was a dreamer, an optimist, a man who could find a reason to laugh even in the darkest of times. "When we get out of this hellhole, Artie," Danny would say, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, unshakable confidence, "I'm gonna be rich. I'm not talking about a little bit of money. I'm talking about buy my own island rich. I'm gonna start a company, something new, something nobody's ever seen before. And you, my friend, you're gonna have a seat on the board." Arthur would just shake his head and smile. Danny's dreams were a welcome distraction from the grim reality that surrounded them. They became inseparable, two halves of a whole. Arthur's quiet steadiness balanced Danny's reckless energy. Danny's humor and optimism kept Arthur from sinking into despair. They covered each other's backs on patrol, shared their last cigarettes, and talked for hours under the strange, unfamiliar stars, sharing their hopes for a future they weren't sure they would ever see. The memory that haunted Arthur most, the one that played over and over in his mind as he stared out at the gray ocean, was their last day together. Their platoon had been ambushed in a narrow valley. The air exploded in a cacophony of gunfire and shouting. Men were falling all around them. Arthur saw Danny go down, his leg torn open by shrapnel. Without thinking, Arthur had scrambled from his cover, dragging Danny behind a rocky outcropping, applying a makeshift tourniquet as bullets whizzed past his head. He had held his friend, talked to him, kept him conscious until the medevac chopper finally arrived. The chaos of the evacuation was a blur. They were loaded onto different helicopters. As his chopper lifted off, Arthur saw Danny on a stretcher below, giving him a weak thumbs-up sign. That was the last time he ever saw him. After the war, Arthur had spent years trying to find him. He wrote letters to the VA, to the Red Cross, to every military organization he could think of. But the records were a mess. Daniel Rivers was a common name. Some reports listed him as killed in action. Others had him transferred to a hospital in Germany, and then the trail went cold. Over time, Arthur had come to accept the most likely and most painful conclusion. Danny had died from his wounds. He had buried the grief deep inside, another ghost in the crowded landscape of his past. Now, on this ship of strangers, adrift and betrayed, the ghost of Danny Rivers felt more real to him than his own children. He remembered Danny's fierce loyalty, his unwavering optimism, his crazy dreams of wealth and adventure. He remembered a time when brotherhood was not a matter of convenience, but a matter of life and death. He stood at the railing, the wind tearing at his hair, and whispered his friend's name into the vast, empty expanse of the ocean. "Danny," he said. It was a prayer, a lament, a final goodbye to the only true brother he had ever known. He felt a profound, aching sense of loss, not just for his wife, not just for his home, but for the man he had been, the man who had known the meaning of true loyalty, a loyalty his own children could not even begin to comprehend. For a week, Arthur remained a recluse, a ghost haunting the lower decks of the Serene Majesty. He had settled into a grim, monotonous routine, a solitary breakfast at dawn, long, aimless walks along the promenade, and evenings spent in his sterile cabin, the brochure for Golden Horizons lying on his nightstand like a death sentence. The ship was a floating paradise, but for Arthur, it was a beautifully appointed prison, each day bringing him closer to his final, lonely destination. One evening, the oppressive silence of his cabin became unbearable. The four walls seemed to be closing in on him, the air thick with the ghosts of his past and the dread of his future. He needed a drink, not for pleasure, but for oblivion. He needed to be somewhere, anywhere, other than alone with his own thoughts. He remembered seeing a small, quiet-looking bar on one of the upper decks, a place that seemed to be the antithesis of the ship's loud, glittering casinos and nightclubs. It was called the Navigator's Lounge, a dark, wood-paneled room with deep leather armchairs and a faint, pleasant scent of cigar smoke and old whiskey. He made his way there, feeling conspicuous in his simple, worn trousers and faded polo shirt. The lounge was, as he had hoped, nearly empty. A few couples murmured quietly in the corners. A lone man read a newspaper at the bar. Arthur found a dark, secluded booth, sank into the soft leather, and ordered a double scotch from a passing waiter. He nursed the drink, letting the fiery liquid burn a slow, welcome path down his throat. He closed his eyes, the low murmur of conversation and the gentle clink of glasses a soothing, anonymous hum. He was invisible here, just another old man drinking alone, and for the first time in days he felt a flicker of something approaching peace. And then he heard it. It was a laugh, a loud, booming, utterly distinctive laugh that cut through the quiet atmosphere of the lounge like a thunderclap. It was a laugh he had not heard in over 50 years, but one that was as familiar to him as his own name. It was a laugh that had echoed through the jungles of Vietnam, a sound of defiant joy in the face of absolute terror. Arthur's eyes snapped open. His heart, which had been beating a slow, mournful rhythm, suddenly began to pound against his ribs. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on a small group of men sitting at a round table near the fireplace. They were well dressed, laughing at a story being told by a man who sat with his back to Arthur. The man was older now, his hair a thick, distinguished silver, his shoulders broader, but there was something in his posture, in the confident, expansive way he gestured with his hands, that was achingly familiar. The man finished his story, and the table erupted in another round of laughter. He leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his drink, and for a moment his profile was illuminated by the firelight. The sharp, aquiline nose, the strong jawline, the ghost of a mischievous grin still playing on his lips. It couldn't be. It was impossible, a cruel trick of grief and memory. But then the man spoke again, his voice deeper, gravelly with age, but carrying the same unmistakable Philadelphia accent, the same confident musical cadence. "So, then I told the general," the man said, "with all due respect, sir, your strategy is about as useful as a screen door on a submarine." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. A screen door on a submarine. It was Danny's favorite phrase, a line he had used for everything from incompetent officers to leaky tents. Arthur stood up, his legs unsteady. The glass of scotch trembled in his hand. He walked slowly, hesitantly, toward the table, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and a wild, surging hope. The other men at the table looked up at him, their conversation faltering as this strange, haunted-looking old man approached. The man with the silver hair turned in his chair, a polite, questioning look on his face. He looked at Arthur, his eyes, a startlingly bright blue, scanning his face with casual curiosity. And then the curiosity sharpened into confusion, then into a dawning, incredulous recognition. The smile faded from his lips. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He squinted, his head tilting slightly, as if trying to place a face from a long-forgotten dream. "Artie?" he whispered, the name a puff of air, a question mark hanging in the smoky lounge. The world seemed to slow down. The murmurs of the bar, the crackle of the fire, the clink of glasses, it all faded into a distant hum. "Danny," Arthur breathed, his voice cracking. Daniel, Danny. Rivers stared at him for a long, silent moment. The years seemed to melt away from his face, the confident billionaire replaced by the young, brash soldier Arthur had known. He saw the farm boy from the Midwest, the quiet, steady friend who had saved his life. "Holy hell," Danny said, his voice thick with an emotion that spanned 5 decades. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and without another word, he closed the distance between them. In the middle of a luxury lounge on a transatlantic cruise ship, 2 old soldiers, 2 ghosts from a forgotten war, embraced. They clung to each other, 2 men who had thought the other long dead, their shared past a sudden, overwhelming presence in the room. Arthur felt the familiar solid strength of his friend's shoulders, and for the first time since he had stepped onto this ship, he was no longer alone. The other men at the table watched in stunned silence, witnesses to a reunion 50 years in the making, a miracle of chance and circumstance unfolding in the most unlikely of places. The one-way ticket to exile had, in a single, breathtaking moment, become a journey home. The reunion was a raw, emotional spectacle that silenced the polite murmurs of the navigator's lounge. Danny, with a dismissive wave to his stunned business associates, steered Arthur to a secluded corner booth, his hand firmly on his old friend's shoulder, as if afraid Arthur might vanish if he let go. A waiter, sensing the gravity of the moment, appeared with a bottle of what looked like very expensive whiskey and 2 glasses, then discreetly disappeared. "Artie," Danny kept saying, shaking his head in disbelief as he poured 2 generous measures. "I can't believe it. I looked for you, for years. The Army, the VA, they told me you were MIA, presumed dead. I went to your hometown a few years after the war, but your family had moved. No forwarding address. I thought I'd lost you. They told me you died in a hospital in Germany," Arthur said, his voice still thick with emotion. "Infection from the leg wound. I got the official letter." Danny let out a short, bitter laugh. "Official letters. They were good at those, weren't they? I almost did die, but I'm too stubborn for that. A German doctor, a real miracle worker, saved my leg and my life." They talked for hours, the whiskey flowing freely, the 50 years between them collapsing into a single, shared narrative. Danny, true to his word, had become a titan. After the war, armed with a small disability pension and an unshakable belief in his own destiny, he had invested in a fledgling computer company. It was a gamble, a long shot, but Danny had always been a gambler. The company, which started in a garage, had exploded during the tech boom. It was now Riverstone Dynamics, a global behemoth in software and hardware, and Daniel "Danny" Rivers, the street kid from Philadelphia, was its reclusive, semi-retired, and fabulously wealthy founder. So, the buy-my-own-island rich thing, that actually happened? Arthur asked, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Danny grinned, the old familiar flash of mischief returning to his eyes. 3 of them, Artie, and a yacht that's bigger than my old neighborhood. It gets boring after a while, though. Too many people telling you yes. I decided to take this cruise incognito, just to remember what it's like to be a normal person, to stand in line for a buffet." He chuckled. "Turns out I'm not very good at it. But if I hadn't been sitting in this exact bar on this exact night—" He trailed off, the immensity of their chance reunion hanging in the air between them. He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "But enough about me. What about you, Artie? What's your story? A wife? Kids? What brings you on this floating palace?" Arthur's smile faded. The warmth of the reunion was suddenly chilled by the cold reality of his situation. He tried to be vague at first. He spoke of Eleanor, of their 40 happy years together, of her long illness and her passing. He spoke of his quiet life, his small house, his retirement. Danny listened patiently, his eyes full of a deep, genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry about your wife, Artie. I wish I could have met her." He paused, then looked at Arthur with a perceptive gaze that had clearly not been dulled by wealth. "But that doesn't explain why you're here, alone, on a transatlantic cruise, looking like you've seen a ghost. And I'm not just talking about me." Arthur looked down at his hands, at the worn, liver-spotted skin. He didn't want to say it. He didn't want to admit the depth of his humiliation, the cruelty of his own children, especially not to Danny, his hero, the man who had conquered the world. "It's complicated," Arthur mumbled. "We've got nothing but time and an ocean of whiskey, my friend," Danny said gently, but with an edge of steel in his voice. "Talk to me, Artie. What did they do to you?" And so the story came tumbling out. The words, once so heavy and shameful, were lighter now, spoken to a man who understood loyalty, who understood debt. Arthur told him everything. He told him about his children's cloying, false concern, their talk of his health and safety. He told him about the gift of a lifetime, the one-way ticket. He told him about the small windowless cabin. And finally, his voice cracking, he told him about the brochure for the Golden Horizons senior residence and the note from his children, exiling him to a foreign country. As Arthur spoke, he saw a transformation come over his friend. The jovial, charismatic billionaire disappeared, replaced by the hard-eyed soldier he had known in the jungles of Vietnam. Danny's face became a mask of cold, controlled fury. His hand, resting on the table, slowly clenched into a fist, the knuckles white. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on Arthur, his jaw tight. When Arthur finished, the silence in the booth was heavy, dangerous. "They did what?" Danny said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "They sold your house? The house you built with your wife? And they put you on this ship to dispose of you?" Arthur could only nod, the shame washing over him again. Danny leaned back, took a long, slow breath, and then looked at Arthur with an intensity that seemed to burn. "Artie," he said, his voice shaken with a rage that was all the more terrifying for its quiet control. "You dragged me through a firefight with half my leg blown off. You saved my life. Everything I have, every island, every stock option, every ridiculous toy I own, exists because of you. I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." He leaned forward again, his blue eyes like chips of ice. "Those people, they are not your family. They are not your children. They are thieves who stole your home and tried to throw you away like a piece of trash." He picked up his glass of whiskey and drained it in one swallow. "Well," he said, placing the glass down with a sharp, definitive click, "the party's over. For them." He pulled out a sleek satellite phone from his jacket pocket. "This cruise just changed its itinerary. Your one-way ticket to exile? I'm upgrading it. We're going home, Artie. And when we get there, we're going to give your children a lesson in family values that they will never, ever forget. They wanted you to have a new beginning? Oh, they have no idea. We're all about to have a new beginning." He began to dial, his fingers moving with a swift, deadly purpose. Arthur watched him, a sense of awe and disbelief washing over him. The ghost of Danny Rivers had not just returned. He had returned as an avenging angel. The moment Danny made that first call, the entire dynamic of the cruise and of Arthur's life shifted with the silent, immense power of a tectonic plate. The reclusive billionaire, who had been playing at being a normal person, shed his disguise. The easygoing charm was replaced by the sharp, decisive authority of a man accustomed to commanding armies, both corporate and literal. His first call was to his chief legal counsel, a man named Marcus Thorne, no relation to Julian from the previous story, a detail that would have amused Robert, who was awakened in his London penthouse at 3 a.m. "Marcus," Danny said, his voice crisp and clear, "I need a full team activated. Now. I'm sending you a name, Arthur Miller. I want a complete workup. His financials, his property records, everything. And I need a parallel investigation into his two children, Mark and Cynthia Miller. I want to know every penny they owe, every late payment, every skeleton in their financial closets. I want it all, and I want it by morning." The second call was to the ship's captain. The conversation was brief and one-sided. Arthur couldn't hear the words, but he saw the effect. Within the hour, a uniformed officer appeared at their table, his expression a mixture of deference and awe. "Mr. Rivers, sir, the officer said. "The captain sends his compliments. The Starlight penthouse has been prepared for you and your guest. Your belongings will be moved immediately. Please let us know if there is anything at all you require." Arthur was led from the dark, smoky lounge through a series of private elevators to the ship's uppermost deck. The Starlight penthouse was not a cabin. It was a sprawling apartment on the sea. It had a living room with a grand piano, a dining room with a table for 12, and a vast private terrace with a hot tub overlooking the endless ocean. The small, windowless room on the lower deck felt like a distant, bad dream. "This is your home now, Artie," Danny said, gesturing around the opulent space, "for as long as we're on this ship." Arthur's life was transformed overnight. He was no longer the invisible old man shuffling along the promenade. He was the personal guest of the ship's most important passenger. He dined at the captain's table, the finest wines and cuisines appearing before him as if by magic. He was invited to private cocktail parties with the other VIPs on board, wealthy industrialists and minor celebrities who treated him with a curious respect, assuming that anyone who was a friend of Daniel Rivers must be a person of consequence. He felt a sense of dizzying disorientation, but also a slow, returning sense of self-worth. He had spent so long feeling like a burden, a relic, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with dignity. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Danny's corporate machine was grinding into motion with terrifying efficiency. Marcus Thorne's team of lawyers and forensic accountants worked through the night. By the time the sun rose over the Atlantic, a detailed dossier was waiting in Danny's secure inbox. The picture it painted was grimly predictable. Mark's small marketing firm was a sinking ship, afloat only on a sea of high-interest loans and unpaid invoices. He had taken out a second mortgage on his home and was months behind on payments. Cynthia and her husband were in even worse shape, buried under a mountain of credit card debt, their lavish lifestyle a facade built on maxed-out accounts and personal loans from shady lenders. The sale of Arthur's house had not been a matter of convenience. It had been an act of absolute desperation. They had sold their father's past to finance their precarious present. "They're drowning," Danny said, scrolling through the financial reports on his tablet as he and Arthur had breakfast on their private terrace. "And they tried to use you as a life raft." His expression was cold. "Well, the rescue party is over." He made his next series of calls, this time to the heads of his financial acquisitions team. The instructions were simple and ruthless. "I want you to buy their debt," he told his team. "All of it. The business loans, the credit cards, the second mortgage. Use our subsidiary funds, the untraceable ones. I want to own every single person they owe money to. I want to become their sole creditor. And I want it done by the time this ship docks in Spain." The plan was brilliant in its cruelty. He wasn't just going to sue them or confront them. He was going to own them. He was going to become the faceless, implacable entity to which they owed their entire existence. For the remainder of the cruise, Arthur lived in a surreal bubble of luxury and impending revenge. He and Danny spent their days reminiscing about the war, filling in the 50-year gap in their lives. They talked about their wives, their triumphs, their regrets. It was a conversation 50 years in the making, a deep and profound healing for both of them. Arthur began to feel like himself again. The stoop in his shoulders straightened. The haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. He was no longer Arthur, the discarded father. He was Artie, the man who had saved his friend's life, the brother who had been found. As the ship neared the coast of Spain, the final pieces of Danny's plan fell into place. His team confirmed that they had successfully and discreetly acquired all of Mark and Cynthia's outstanding debts. They were now, for all intents and purposes, owned by Riverstone Dynamics. "Ready to go home, Artie?" Danny asked one evening as they stood on their terrace, watching the distant lights of Europe appear on the horizon. Arthur looked at the approaching coastline, the destination that was supposed to be his final, lonely exile. "I'm not sure I have a home to go back to," he said softly. Danny put a hand on his shoulder. "Oh, you have a home," he said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "And we're going to get it back, along with your dignity, with interest. This isn't the end of your journey, my friend. It's just the beginning of theirs." Back home, Mark and Cynthia were living in a state of blissful, self-congratulatory ignorance. They had done it. They had solved the dad problem with what they considered to be a stroke of genius. They had offloaded their burdensome father, liquidated his primary asset, and secured the funds they so desperately needed to keep their own teetering lives from collapsing. The money from the sale of Arthur's house had been a lifeline. Mark had paid off his most aggressive creditors, staving off the immediate threat of bankruptcy for his struggling firm. Cynthia had settled her most pressing credit card debts, silencing the incessant, threatening phone calls. They felt a sense of profound relief, the giddy, reckless euphoria of people who have narrowly escaped a disaster of their own making. Their guilt, if it ever truly existed, was quickly and efficiently rationalized away. They told themselves they had done the right thing. "Dad is probably having the time of his life," Cynthia said to Mark over the phone one afternoon, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "He's probably making all sorts of new friends. It's so much better for him than rattling around in that old house." "Exactly," Mark agreed readily. "And the care at Golden Horizons is top-notch. We did him a favor, really. We gave him security in his old age." They sent Arthur occasional, perfunctory text messages, carefully crafted to project an image of loving, concerned children. "Hi, Dad. Hope you're enjoying the sunshine. The weather here is miserable. Thinking of you. Dad, just checking in. Did you try the shuffleboard yet? We're clearing out the house. So much old junk. It's a huge job, but don't you worry about a thing." Each message was a small, self-serving performance, designed more to soothe their own consciences than to connect with their father. They didn't expect a reply. They knew he was terrible with technology. They pictured him sitting on a deck chair, basking in the sun, blissfully unaware of the new life they had arranged for him, a life of managed decline in a foreign country. They began to plan their own futures with the remaining money. A new car for Mark, a kitchen renovation for Cynthia, a family vacation to Hawaii, once things settled down. They were already spending the money from the sale of their father's memories, their conversations filled with the easy, careless confidence of people who believe they have gotten away with something. The cruise, for them, was a timeline, a countdown to their own financial salvation. As the ship made its slow, inexorable journey across the Atlantic, they felt the pressure lifting, the future brightening. They were free. The day the Serene Majesty was scheduled to dock in Malaga, Spain, they waited with a sense of quiet anticipation. They expected a call, either from Arthur, confused and disoriented, or from the staff at Golden Horizons, confirming that their new resident had arrived safely. The morning passed. No call. The afternoon wore on. Still nothing. "Maybe he's just settling in," Cynthia said to Mark, a flicker of annoyance in her voice. "You'd think he'd at least let us know he arrived." "He probably doesn't even know how to use the international call-in plan we got him," Mark replied with a sigh. "The staff will call. Don't worry." But the staff at Golden Horizons did not call, because Arthur was not there. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, casting a golden glow on the port of Malaga, Arthur and Danny were disembarking the Serene Majesty. They were not met by a shuttle bus from a retirement home. They were met by a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows, which whisked them away from the bustling cruise terminal. They bypassed the city entirely, driving directly to a private airfield on the outskirts of town. Waiting for them on the tarmac, its engines humming softly in the twilight, was a Gulfstream G650, Danny's private jet. Arthur stood for a moment at the foot of the aircraft's steps, looking back at the massive cruise ship still docked in the harbor. It looked like a monument to a life he had narrowly escaped. He had boarded that ship as an exile, a man stripped of his home and his dignity. He was leaving as a man with a purpose, a brother by his side, and an arsenal of financial power at his command. "Ready to go home, Artie?" Danny asked, clapping him on the shoulder. Arthur looked at his friend, at the man who had been a ghost for 50 years, and was now the most real thing in his life. "I am," he said, his voice steady. "It's time to settle some accounts." They boarded the jet. The luxurious leather seats, the polished wood paneling, the quiet, attentive flight attendant offering them champagne. It was a world away from the windowless cabin where this journey had begun. As the jet soared into the night sky, heading west, back across the ocean they had just crossed, Arthur felt a profound sense of calm. It was the calm before the storm. Back home, his children were sleeping, secure in their betrayal, dreaming of their new, debt-free lives. They had no idea that the storm was coming for them. They had no idea that their father, the man they had sent into exile, was currently flying home at 600 miles per hour, ready to reclaim everything they had taken from him and more. The quiet, lonely voyage was over. The homecoming was about to begin. While Arthur and Danny were flying across the Atlantic in the silent luxury of the Gulf Stream, a different kind of storm was gathering in his children's lives. The temporary relief their father's money had provided was already evaporating, and the old, familiar pressures were beginning to mount again. Mark was sitting in his office, a small, rented space that always smelled faintly of desperation, staring at a pile of overdue bills. The money from the house sale had been a temporary patch, not a solution. His marketing firm was still bleeding clients, and a major account he had been counting on had just pulled out. He was staring at the abyss again, the threat of bankruptcy looming larger than ever. His secretary buzzed him on the intercom, her voice tight with an unusual formality. "Mr. Miller," she said, "there are some gentlemen here to see you. They say it's about your primary credit line." Mark sighed. It was probably the bank coming to tighten the screws again. "Send them in," he said wearily. The door opened, but it was not the familiar, harried face of his local bank manager. two men in impeccably tailored dark suits walked in. They moved with an unnerving, silent confidence. They did not introduce themselves. They simply placed a thick, leather-bound folder on his desk. "Mr. Mark Miller," the taller of the two men said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We represent a consortium of private lenders who have recently acquired the entirety of your outstanding business and personal debts. As of 9 a.m. this morning, we are your sole creditor." Mark stared at them, his mouth suddenly dry. "What? That's not possible. I have loans with 5 different banks." "You had loans with 5 different banks," the second man corrected him. "Now, you have one loan, with us, and we are here to inform you that, due to a review of your company's high-risk financial profile, we are calling in the entire loan, effective immediately." "Immediately?" Mark choked out. "You can't do that. That's millions of dollars. I'll be ruined." "That is correct," the first man said, his expression unchanging. "You have 24 hours to remit the full amount, or we will initiate bankruptcy proceedings and begin the process of liquidating all of your assets. Your home, your cars, this office, everything." He paused, then added a final, chilling detail. "We have also been instructed to inform you that the new owner of your debt wishes to have a personal meeting with you tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, here." Before Mark could even process this, they turned and walked out, leaving the folder on his desk. It contained a detailed, terrifying summary of every penny he owed. His world had just imploded. At the same time, across town, Cynthia was experiencing her own version of this financial apocalypse. She was at a high-end boutique, trying to soothe her anxieties with a bit of retail therapy, when her credit card was declined. Annoyed, she tried another. Declined, and another. Declined. Her phone rang. It was a representative from her bank's fraud department. "Mrs. Cynthia," the woman said, her voice polite but firm. "We're calling to inform you that all of your credit lines have been frozen. A private financial group has purchased your outstanding debt and has placed a hold on all your accounts pending immediate repayment." Cynthia felt a wave of nausea. "What? What financial group? This has to be a mistake." "There is no mistake, ma'am," the woman replied. "The new creditor has also requested we pass on a message. He would like to meet with you tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at your brother's office." The next morning, Mark and Cynthia met in the parking lot of Mark's office building. They were both pale, their faces etched with fear and confusion. "What is happening?" Cynthia wailed. "Who are these people?" "I don't know," Mark said, his voice a ragged whisper. "But they own us. They own everything." They went up to the office together, 2 condemned prisoners walking to their execution. They sat in the waiting room, the silence thick with dread. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door to Mark's office opened, and their father walked out. He was not the stooped, weary old man they had put on the cruise ship. He stood tall, dressed in a simple but perfectly tailored new suit. His eyes, which had been clouded with grief, were now clear, sharp, and cold as ice. He looked at them not with anger, not with sadness, but with the detached, appraising gaze of a man looking at a problem he was about to solve. Behind him stood another man, older, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that radiated an aura of immense power and authority. Mark and Cynthia stared, their minds unable to comprehend the scene. "Dad," Mark whispered. "What? What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Spain." "My plans changed," Arthur said, his voice calm and steady. He gestured to the man beside him. Mark, Cynthia, I'd like you to meet my oldest and dearest friend, Daniel Rivers. You may know him better as the founder and chairman of Riverstone Dynamics, or, as of yesterday, as the man who owns every single penny of your debt. The name hit them like a physical blow. Riverstone Dynamics, one of the largest, most powerful corporations in the world. Their new, mysterious creditor was one of the richest men on the planet, and he was standing here next to their father. Danny stepped forward, his smile thin and dangerous. It's a pleasure to finally meet the two of you, he said, his voice soft but laced with menace. My friend Artie has told me so much about your unique approach to family values. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place in their minds with horrifying clarity. The cruise, the timing, the sudden, coordinated financial attack. This wasn't a random banking issue. This was a planned, deliberate, and devastating act of retribution. You did this? Cynthia stammered, looking at her father. No, Arthur corrected her. You did this. You made your choices. You sold my home. You sent me into exile. You treated me like garbage to be disposed of. You just never imagined the garbage would have a friend with a private jet and a team of very aggressive lawyers. He stepped aside, revealing the two men in dark suits who had visited Mark the day before, now standing silently by the door. You are both bankrupt, Arthur stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. Your homes will be seized. Your accounts are frozen. Your lives as you know them are over. Cynthia began to sob, a raw, ugly sound. Mark just stared, his face a mask of utter ruin. However, Danny said, stepping forward again, my friend Artie is a more merciful man than I am. So, we are prepared to make you an offer. He leaned against Mark's expensive desk, the picture of casual, absolute power. You can avoid personal bankruptcy, litigation, and the public humiliation that will surely follow on one condition. You will work to pay back every single cent you owe. Not just to the banks, but to your father, for the house you stole from him. Work? Mark croaked. My company's finished. Oh, you'll have jobs, Danny said with a chilling smile. We've already arranged them. Mark, you're a man of marketing, of vision. You'll be joining the sanitation department of one of my subsidiary companies. You'll be starting on the night shift. Waste management. It's a growth industry. He then turned to Cynthia. And you, my dear, with your eye for luxury and your expensive tastes. You'll be working in the laundry service of the very hospital where your mother spent her final days. You'll be washing sheets, scrubbing floors. It's honest work, and it will give you plenty of time to reflect on the meaning of true care and comfort. He stood up straight. Those are the terms. You will work until the debt is paid. You will live in a small, subsidized apartment we have arranged for you. You will learn what it means to earn a living, to be responsible, to be humble. Or you can refuse, and we will unleash the full force of the legal and financial world upon you. The choice is yours. Mark and Cynthia stood in the ruins of their lives, their faces a mixture of horror, disbelief, and the dawning, terrible understanding that they had not just betrayed their father. They had declared war on a king, and his army had just burned their world to the ground. The aftermath was not swift, nor was it clean. For Mark and Cynthia, The descent from their comfortable suburban lives into the harsh reality of manual labor and financial ruin was a brutal, daily humiliation. Mark, who had once commanded boardrooms, now spent his nights hauling trash cans in the cold, pre-dawn hours. Cynthia, who had once browsed high-end boutiques, now spent her days in the steamy, bleach-scented basement of the hospital, folding sheets and mopping floors. They were stripped of everything they had valued: their status, their possessions, their social standing. Their friends, the ones who'd admired their success, disappeared. They were left with nothing but the stark, unvarnished truth of their own choices. Arthur and Danny did not abandon them to this fate entirely. They were monitored. A portion of their meager salaries was automatically deducted to repay their debts. They were provided with basic, no-frills housing. It was not a punishment designed to destroy them, but a harsh, unforgiving education designed to rebuild them from the ground up. Arthur, meanwhile, began to build his new life. He and Danny, two old soldiers who had found each other again in the twilight of their lives, decided not to live apart. They bought a large, comfortable house on a quiet lake outside the city. It was a house with wide porches, big windows, and enough room for both of them to have their own space, but enough warmth to feel like a shared home. The house that had belonged to Arthur and Eleanor was sold again, this time with Arthur's full consent. The proceeds, combined with a significant portion of Danny's vast fortune, were used to establish a new foundation. They called it the Brothers in Arms Fund. It was not a typical charity. Its mission was twofold. First, it provided support for aging veterans, helping them with housing, medical care, and companionship. Second, it established a legal aid service for elderly individuals who were victims of familial financial abuse. People like Arthur, who had been targeted by their own children. Arthur found a new purpose. He was not just a figurehead. He was the heart of the foundation. He would visit veterans' homes, sit with the men, and listen to their stories. He understood their loneliness, their sense of being forgotten by a world they had fought to protect. He would meet with the elderly clients of their legal aid service, his own story a powerful testament to the fact that it was never too late to fight for one's dignity. He was no longer a burden, a relic, or a problem to be solved. He was a source of strength, a beacon of hope for others. Danny, for his part, found a joy he had not known in decades of corporate success. He poured his energy and resources into the foundation, finding more satisfaction in helping one forgotten veteran than he ever had in a billion-dollar merger. The two old friends had, in their final years, found a new war to fight, a war against loneliness, neglect, and injustice. Months turned into a year. Arthur received occasional, stilted letters from his children. They were filled with resentment at first, then a weary resignation, and finally, slowly, a dawning sense of self-awareness. They spoke of the simple, brutal exhaustion of a day's hard labor, of the quiet dignity of the people they worked alongside. They were learning, in the most difficult way possible, the lessons Arthur had tried to teach them their whole lives. One afternoon, as Arthur and Danny were sitting on their porch overlooking the lake, a car pulled into the long driveway. It was a modest, second-hand sedan. Mark got out. He was thinner, his face weathered, his hands calloused. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing the simple, clean uniform of his sanitation job. He walked up to the porch and stood before his father. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for forgiveness. "I just wanted to tell you," he said, his voice quiet and steady, "that one of the men on my crew, an old guy named Sal, his wife is sick. He was going to lose his apartment. The foundation, your foundation, paid his rent for the next 6 months. He doesn't know I'm your son. He just told me that there are still good people in the world." He paused, his throat working. "He was right," he said. "Thank you, Dad, for showing me what a good man actually does." He didn't stay. He just nodded, turned, and got back in his car. Arthur watched him drive away, a complex mixture of sadness and a faint, flickering hope in his heart. The path to redemption for his children would be long, and they would have to walk it alone. But, for the first time, he believed it was possible. He turned to Danny, who had been watching the exchange in silence. Danny raised his glass of whiskey in a silent toast. "To the long cruise home, Artie," he said. Arthur smiled, a real, deep smile that reached his eyes. "To the long cruise home, my friend." He looked out at the lake, at the calm, clear water reflecting the endless sky. His children, in their greed and cruelty, had put him on a ship and sent him into exile. They had intended it to be a one-way ticket to oblivion. They had no idea that they had actually sent him on the greatest journey of his life, a journey that had allowed him to lose a family that had forgotten him, only to find the brother who had never stopped searching. And that, he knew, was the true treasure, a fortune that could never be bought, sold, or stolen. It could only be earned.